6 years after the release of the original 16-35 G Master lens, Sony has finally given us the smaller, lighter 16-35 version 2. It's got all the new bells and whistles, upgraded image quality, better focus breathing, better close focusing, and more. But the question is, how much better is this lens than the original, and is it worth the upgrade? If you're anything like me, you have been waiting for this lens to come out. Like every time that Sony put out a new lens, I was sitting there thinking, this is it, this is gonna be it. And then it wasn't. We've seen a ton of updates lately in the Sony lens lineup, and this rounds out the version 2s of all of the main G Master zoom lenses. So we're gonna take a look at everything that this new flagship ultra-wide zoom has to offer, including some photo and video examples. We're gonna compare it to the older 16-35 lens as well, and hopefully help you decide whether it's worth the money and whether it's worth the upgrade. As always, let's kick things off with a short video sequence so that you can see this lens in action and decide for yourself whether you like it or not. So, secure the cup and let's get into it.
The following sequence was shot entirely with the Sony 16-35 G Master version 2.
With all the new lenses that Sony's been putting out lately, one of the biggest changes that we've seen across the board is them getting smaller and lighter. And that is definitely the case with the 16-35, but it may not be as much as you would have expected. Overall, the new version is about 10% shorter than the old version, but it may not look that way at first. When they're both at 35mm, which is their smallest, the new lens is 118mm, whereas the old one is 127mm, which isn't a huge difference necessarily. And just so it's said, these are numbers that I measured myself, not Sony's marketing numbers. Where the difference might be more noticeable is when both of the barrels are extended when they're at 16mm focal length. When extended, the new lens is 124mm, whereas the old lens is 141mm, so a much bigger difference than when they weren't extended. So yes, that does mean that the new 16-35 still has an extending barrel, but if we review those numbers again, 118mm to 124mm at its longest, that's only 6mm of extension on this barrel. That's literally the size of like 3/4 stacked on top of each other. Because of this, the new 16-35 is a great lens for gimbal work because you're not going to have to rebalance basically at all with that little extension on it. And even though they share the same 82mm front filter thread, this one is actually a little bit narrower in the body of it as well. Now, of course, with that extending barrel, you may have the question of weather sealing, but since this is a G Master lens, of course we have the Sony dust and moisture moisture protection that they always kind of guarantee on their higher end lenses. So go ahead and put it to work in the rain or in dirty locations. Just maybe like don't throw it in the ocean. We've got the standard autofocus manual focus toggle switch as well as a custom button. They've added one more custom button on top that we didn't have on the older 16-35 as well. And then one thing that's completely new here is that we've got an iris or aperture ring to control the aperture of the lens. Also included with the aperture ring is the iris lock, which allows us to lock it either in the A mode, which means that we're controlling it with the camera body, or in the other mode, which is to control it with the lens itself. And then on the other side, we've also got a click or de-click mode, which means that we can make smooth movements with the aperture if we want to. Mostly this will be used for making aperture movements during filming in video mode, but get creative, use it for whatever you want. One thing that I'm a little disappointed they didn't include on this lens is the smooth and tight zoom ring mode that we saw on the 24-70 version 2. It's not necessary, but it's nice to have so that you don't bump the zoom ring and change what your focal length is at. I really liked it on my 24-70, and I would have loved to seen it on this lens as well. All that being said, the zoom and focus rings do feel really nice and smooth on this lens, and the manual focus on it is nearly linear, so you can do nice repeated focus pulls. If we're getting really nitpicky here, I did actually prefer the little bit of extra kind of friction that I felt on the older 16-35 on both the zoom and manual focus rings. And even with all the premium materials and stuff that you would expect in a new G Master lens, they still managed to shave off 20% of the weight from the old 16-35. When it comes to the image quality of this lens, I've definitely been happy. In terms of that kind of wow factor when you take a photo or video and you just review it on the back of the camera, I'd give it like an 8 out of 10, which is pretty good. You can definitely see that it's a high quality image even before you start pixel peeping. I did notice that the new 16-35 came out a little bit warmer than the old 16-35, which is kind of funny because that's the same thing that I said about the Sigma 16-28 f2.8. And there's also a little bit of extra contrast from this lens compared to the older one as well, which may have something to do with the extra sharpness that we're getting from this lens. Sharpness is pretty awesome from corner to corner on this lens, even at f2.8. The older version was pretty nice in the center, but it did struggle as you got further out to the edges. I did also compare this lens to the 35mm f1.4 G Master, both at f2.8, and while the prime lens did look a little bit better, I was really happy with how this one held its own. We're getting extremely clean images out of this lens with longitudinal and lateral chromatic aberration basically being non-existent, straight out of camera, even if you turn off all of the compensation. Both flaring and ghosting are really well controlled, so if you're shooting towards a bright subject, you're not gonna have any problems there. It's not gonna ruin any shots for you or anything. And if you're into sun stars, this does produce really nice looking ones, if that's something you're looking to do. There is some vignetting going on in this lens, more at the 16mm end than at the 35mm end. I definitely recommend keeping the vignetting correction on in your camera body if you can. It's still there, but it is definitely way better if you have that correction turned on. Distortion is also more prominent at 16mm than it is at 35mm, but again, you've got that correction in the camera that makes it basically non-existent, so please just leave that on. The bokeh from this lens is really pleasing as well. We don't have any kind of crazy fringing around the outsides. There's not a whole lot of cat's eye when you get into the corners, and no onion ringing effect. Basically, if you like bokeh balls, this is a great lens for it. So overall image quality out of this lens is superb, but to be completely honest, if it wasn't, it would be really disappointing coming from a previous lens that was already pretty great. But that isn't the end of the new features on this lens. We've also got some new stuff with focusing. As with most of the new Sony glass that we've been seeing lately, this has the new XD motors inside it, which means that it's insanely fast, super accurate, and silent. So you can take advantage of the new camera bodies that Sony's been putting out with all their new autofocus technology. But that I was pretty much expecting to happen. What I wasn't expecting necessarily was that the close focusing on this lens got a lot better from the previous version. I would say that was actually one of my biggest frustrations with that previous lens, is that I would get everything set up, I would have the shot that I would want, and then I would get into the place where I wanted to be and try and focus, and I couldn't get close enough. With this lens, it feels much more right, I guess, where the close focusing of this lens allows me to get in the spot that I actually want to get. And just in case you wanted that translated into actual numbers, close focusing on the new lens is 22 centimeters, whereas on the old lens it was about 28 centimeters. Another big change that they managed to make in this lens that I'm hugely thankful for is the focus breathing. It's so much better than the old lens, and I'm not talking about the focus breathing compensation that we have in some of the newer Sony cameras. You can go ahead and turn that off because focus breathing on this lens is actually so great. So even if you have a camera that doesn't have breathing compensation in it, you're going to be really happy using this lens. So with the introduction of all these version 2 lenses that we've been seeing from Sony, this has been highly anticipated, and the big question is it enough of an upgrade for the price? Because we all know that G Master lenses are not cheap by any means. And my answer to the question of is it worth it is yes, but just barely. Literally everything has been upgraded on this version of the lens, just not by an insane margin. But I think that says a lot more about the original 16-35 and how well it stood the test of time than it does about this lens. They're both fantastic lenses. This one's just more fantastic-er. Personally, I will be picking up the new version of this lens. I think there's enough going on here that it does justify an upgrade for me. But if you do own the older version of the 16-35 and it doesn't make sense for you, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. That's still a great lens. But as always, I want to hear from you, so leave a comment down below, and on your way down there, hit the like and subscribe button. Make sure to check out this video next. I think you'll really like it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey.